The next item of business is a debate on motion 14524 in the name of John Swinney on creating a modern, diverse, dynamic Scotland. I'd be grateful if members who wish to speak in the debate were to press the request to speak buttons. And I call on John Swinney to speak to and move the motion. Up to 12 minutes, First Minister.
President Officer, from my experience in taking part in every year of this Parliament since it was reconvened 25 years ago, one thing is very clear to me, that no matter where any of us sit in this chamber, each of us stood for election because we care deeply about Scotland's future. We stood for election because we know that decisions about Scotland's future are best determined by people living here in Scotland. And no matter where we sit in this chamber, I think we can also agree it's our aspiration that Scotland maintains her place in the world as a modern, diverse and dynamic nation. Scotland is the home of poets, painters, engineers, doctors and thinkers throughout the ages. We're a nation on the cutting edge of solving many of the 21st century's most complex challenges. We're an outward-looking country that values our relationship with our neighbours and friends across the world, and it's in that spirit that I open this debate this afternoon. There exists in Scotland a range of opinions and emotions that we must embrace and discuss openly and respectfully, because, as I'm about to set out, to do so is to maintain the very health of our democracy itself, a democracy each of us has stood for election to represent. It's a story of the pursuit of self-determination, which found new momentum when, in 1997, the people of Scotland voted overwhelmingly to reconvene the Scottish Parliament. It was clear then, and it's clear now, that Scotland is a nation with all the talent, the creativity and the ingenuity to chart her own course and to steer her own democratic institutions. And the positive impact of devolution is indisputable. For 25 years, devolution has improved the lives of people in Scotland, making this a better and a fairer place to live through policies such as equal marriage, free personal care for older people, minimum unit pricing for alcohol, free bus travel for over 2 million people, a ban on smoking in public places, land reform and, very close to my heart, action on child poverty through measures such as the Scottish Child Payment. Among many other achievements, since 2007, this government has used the powers of devolution to introduce the baby box, giving every baby born and resident in Scotland the support to have the best start in life by providing families with essential items needed in the first 6 months of a child's life, or ensuring that Scottish domiciled students continue to receive free university tuition, unlike elsewhere in the United Kingdom, given that we abolished the graduate endowment fee in 2008, or the introduction of free prescriptions, which are now £9.90 per item south of the border, and a huge cost for low-income families, or our council tax reduction scheme that reduces the tax bills of over 450,000 people in Scotland, or perhaps even free personal and nursing care, which is extended to everyone who needs it, regardless of age, or the affordable housing programme, which has delivered 128,000 affordable homes, the majority for social rent, and, of course, 1,140 hours of funded early learning and childcare, which, if families were to purchase the funded childcare provided by the Scottish Government, it would cost more than £5,500 per eligible child per year. None of this has been achieved by the Scottish Government in isolation, but through the strength of this Parliament and our common commitment to Scotland's self-determination. So regardless of where members sit in this chamber, regardless of whether members view everything I have listed as successes or not, I trust that Parliament will agree that people living in Scotland are substantially better off with a Parliament that fights their corner, that leads for progress and that champions the value of our unique and diverse communities from every single corner of our country. So each of us in this chamber is extremely fortunate, for this Parliament gives each of us a voice. And whenever we enter this building, as unique as Scotland itself, it reminds us of our duty to ensure the people of Scotland are heard too. Our modern, diverse and dynamic democracy is our greatest asset. And in many ways, 2014 was a year that proved that. The Equal Marriage Bill passed, introducing one of the most progressive equal marriage bills in the world, and sending out a clear message about who we are as a nation. Turnout for the independence referendum was the highest recorded at any Scotland-wide poll since the advent of universal suffrage. And that referendum was preceded by a genuine and serious national debate on the future of our nation. Now, I wish to acknowledge the national debate wasn't easy for every voter. There were certainly lively discussions. But maintaining a healthy democracy is hard because it requires us to navigate our differences respectfully. If that were easy, we wouldn't observe the sharp rises in populism that can emerge in times of economic hardship and uncertainty. But when I think back to 10 years ago, I can think of no better example of modern democracy in action. Both the Scottish and the United Kingdom governments published detailed papers of their arguments. There were vigorous campaigns and grassroots involvement of people across the country, and the historic importance of the decision was reflected in the length of time allowed for both sides to make their cases. Presiding Officer, the people of Scotland were able to take their decision, and my firm view in opening this debate today is that the people of Scotland should have the opportunity to take that decision again. This Parliament has confirmed its belief that it should be open to any nation of the United Kingdom to choose to withdraw from the Union by democratic means. That is my view, and I believe that view of this Parliament should be respected. Since the 2014 independence referendum, and sadly since Brexit, which Scotland did not vote for, it's clear that the powers and the autonomy of the Scottish Parliament have been eroded. They've been eroded by the excuse of Brexit to enable Westminster to overrule this Parliament. The people of this country who voted for this Parliament to have the powers it does were not asked if they wanted the powers to be eroded. Of course I will.
Douglas Ross.
I'm grateful to the First Minister for giving way. As he's speaking about powers, can he outline how many powers he has been offered by the UK Government but has returned to the UK Government because the SNP weren't ready to take them on?
First Minister.
Well, it's clear from what I set out in my earlier comments that and in comments that I made earlier on today, that since the independence referendum in 2014, there has been a strengthening of some of the powers of this Parliament about tax, which we've used. Mr Ross complains about the fact that we've used our tax powers. We've used the powers on welfare, for example, with the Scottish Child Payment, which is helping to keep 100,000 children out of poverty. And I think Mr Ross voted against the budget that provided for that, so he's not exactly got a strong argument to stand on. But the point I'm concerned about is that the powers I'm concerned about is that in a democratic referendum in 1997, the people of Scotland voted for the powers of this Parliament, and those powers have been eroded by legislation that Mr Ross himself voted for in the House of Commons. So the weakening of our powers, and this is the point I would make to Mr Ross, the weakening of our powers should concern every one of us here. For it's our duty to ensure this Parliament's powers to represent Scotland's will and Scotland's aspirations should be protected. Of course I will.
Douglas Ross.
I'll try a different question then. Can the First Minister tell this Parliament one single power that has been taken away by the UK Government from the Scottish Government?
First Minister.
The use of the internal market...
Mr Ross.
Well, I'll explain to Mr Ross exactly what's happened if he's not familiar with what he's voted for. This Parliament had exclusive power over a range of competences devolved by the United Kingdom Parliament. That was what was put to people in the 1997 referendum, and it was supported by 3-1, if my memory serves me correct, back then. The Internal Market Act then gives the United Kingdom Government the ability to legislate in those areas and to act in those areas. That is called the erosion of the powers of the Scottish Parliament. And that's before I get to the point that between 1997 and 2019, when there have been Labour, Conservative and Conservative Liberal coalitions in Westminster, the Sewell Convention was never ignored on any single occasion. But it was ignored, superseded, countermanded by the Conservative government on countless occasions legislating over the heads of this democratically elected institution, and that should be a matter of the greatest concern to the Conservatives, as it is to me today. So, Presiding Officer, Scotland has prospered with the use of the devolved powers that we have at our disposal. And Scotland demonstrated in the aftermath of 1997 that we had the capability to assume those powers. And of course, since then, Scotland's economy outperforms the UK in growth in GDP per person, growth in productivity, earnings growth and foreign direct investment. We have an impressive record on GDP per capita, growing faster than the UK since 2007. Since 2007, productivity in Scotland has grown at an average rate faster than the rest of the United Kingdom. And when we look at the evidence from comparable independent European states, many of them same in size as Scotland, we can see that they perform better than the United Kingdom. So that poses the question for me of what is the opportunity for Scotland to move forward. And the opportunity for Scotland is to ensure that we deploy the strength and the capability of our country to the maximum effect for the future of our country, ensuring that decisions made in Scotland by the Scottish Parliament are respected and able to be effective across all the areas of policy that any government would take for granted. I believe an independent Scotland should be able to rejoin the European Union and be able to pursue the prospects of growth and opportunity that so many of our people and our businesses want to enjoy. I believe an independent Scotland could deliver a fairer and a more welcoming system of migration, helping the economy to grow while addressing depopulation challenges and supporting vital public services. I believe an independent Scotland would remove sensibly and safely nuclear weapons from Scotland's shores for good, and that an independent Scotland would be able to benefit from the terms of a written constitution, to benefit from the investment in our public services, using our wealth to secure the future of our country. All of that is possible based on the experience of devolution, where Scottish self-determination, the principle of decisions being taken in this country, are best taken by the people who choose to live here and those who are elected to act on their behalf. That is the foundation of the argument for Scottish independence. It's the foundation of what people have experienced with devolution. It is urgent and essential that Scotland becomes independent, and I move the motion in my name that sets out that case.
Thank you. I now call on Douglas Ross to speak to and move Amendment 14524.4 up to 8 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I move the amendment in my name. I want to start by imagining a different decade to the one we've had. Not a different outcome on the 18th of September 2014, because the people of Scotland voted by a clear margin to remain part of the United Kingdom. Now, I want to imagine what would have happened if John Swinney and his fellow nationalists had been true to their word and respected the result. If they'd used the last 10 years and the powers of this Parliament to focus on improving the lives of every man, woman and child in this country. Sadly, they didn't. And even a decade on, we're not discussing what this Parliament or this government could do to benefit our constituents. No, we are, yet again, debating independence. Now, unlike the nationalists, I refuse to talk Scotland down. I believe that Scotland...
Let's hear Mr Ross.
I believe that Scotland is a modern, dynamic, diverse country. It's set out in my amendment. But the SNP don't believe that. It's clear from John Swinney's motion. And what a brutal self-assessment of their 17 years in office and how they failed this country. Because where there are failures and challenges facing all of us in Scotland, they've not been caused by the decision of millions of Scots to remain in the United Kingdom. They've been caused by the SNP, the nationalists in government over the last 17 years. They have been caused by a distracted nationalist government that has spent its time in office obsessing about the Constitution rather than focusing on the real priorities for Scots. I'll give way.
To First Minister.
I'm a big fan of being true to your word. So what would have happened if the Conservatives had been true to their word vote no to stay in the EU, vote no to be an equal partner in the UK and vote no to be more prosperous. What happened to those promises?
I'm sorry, the Deputy First Minister can't pick and choose. One choice, the Nationalists told us in 2014, a once-in-a-generation opportunity, a gold-plated referendum which they would respect, and they have spent the last decade refusing to do so. But I was speaking about the impact this has had. And let's look at Scotland after almost 2 decades of the SNP in charge. We're a country where alcohol and drugs kills thousands of people every year, where educational standards continue to fall and violence in our classroom continues to rise. And yes, Neil Gray, our NHS is in crisis. Well, he's still shaking his head. I cannot believe the Health Secretary does not believe that our health service is in crisis. I'm happy to give way if he can tell us why it's not, when 1 in 6 of our fellow Scots is on an NHS waiting list.
Neil Gray.
I refuse to talk down the work of our incredible staff and committed workforce within our health service. But there was a list there that the First Minister provided of the government's interventions over our time in government, and I'll pick just one: free prescriptions. The Trussell Trust has assessed that 68% of people on universal credit in the rest of the UK cannot afford to pick up their prescriptions. Can Douglas Ross not understand the value, not just from a social perspective, but from a health perspective, of the intervention that we're making and the investment we're making on free prescriptions?
Douglas Ross, can the Health Secretary not understand that we have the highest drug deaths, not in the United Kingdom, but across Europe? We have 1 in 6 on an NHS waiting list. That is a crisis. And the fact that he refuses and is unwilling to accept that will be a bitter blow to people watching this on that NHS waiting list, waiting for treatment, waiting for an appointment, and they just don't get it because it's not their obsession of independence. And far from accepting the result of the referendum, every year since then, every year since the vote didn't go the way the SNP wanted, they've called for a rerun of the referendum. It's as if the first vote didn't count. That was, a proxy one, and we'll come back later. It's as if Scottish voters somehow didn't understand or realise the choice they faced. But democracy is not about asking the same question time and time again until you get the result you want. It's about putting forward your arguments, trusting the people with that decision, and then accepting their verdict. I've given way twice. Is there extra time?
There is no extra time.
I'm sorry,
today.
I have given way twice to the SNP front bench. Now, John Swinney in his motion claims that independence is normal. But what is not normal is a democracy in which the government ignores the democratic vote of the people. Scotland continues to be shackled by a separatist political ideology we did not vote for. The Scottish people want us to move on from this. And if that wasn't crystal clear for the SNP government before the general election, it should be now. They said they wanted to use that election as a de facto referendum. Well, the people of Scotland have once again said no. Now is the time for all of us to really move on, to use the powers of this Parliament to create a better Scotland, instead of blaming others and promising unicorns in an imaginary future. Right across our country, people want change. They can see that the services they use every day are getting worse. Hospitals overcrowded, schools underperforming, our police stretched to breaking point. And they're being asked to pay more for that while getting less. And they look to this Parliament for answers. And they see this: a chamber trapped in a time warp discussing an issue which addresses none of the challenges they are facing. If the public, and if any of them are actually watching this, they'd be forgiven for thinking this was a repeat, that the year was 2014, not 2024. Because this is what's happened to the SNP government. It has utterly failed to move on, to commit to the new challenges and the missions that need to be dealt with, and to prove that they have a purpose and a reason to stay in government. Nicola Sturgeon promised that education would be her #1 priority and closing the attainment gap would be her government's defining mission. Well, Scottish school performance is at record lows and the attainment gap is as wide as it's ever been. Hamza Yousaf promised to eradicate child poverty, but the rate has increased since 2010. And John Swinney is making the same hollow promise now with no credible proposition to deliver it. I'm sorry, I'm very tight in time. If there was an opportunity to get more time, I would.
Key interventions is a matter for members within the time
I've taken
allocated.
two already from the front bench. As historians look back over the last 10 years, they will see them as Scotland's lost decade. The years in which we divided our country and fought bitter arguments against ourselves over an issue we had already voted on. Generations of Scots will come to see this as a national act of self-harm. They will wonder why some chose to continue the same arguments again and again, why the government of the day chose to indulge in fantasy politics instead of dealing with the real issues faced by our country, or why the national interest was ignored for the SNP's nationalist interest. They will see through the empty promises and understand that for the last 10 years that the independence debate has been a distraction and a deflection from other issues, a pledge wheeled out election after election to avoid having to stand on their own record and a way to blame Westminster for all its ills that Scotland faces, and ultimately to avoid taking responsibility for the grave errors they have made. So on this, the 10th anniversary of the 2014 independence referendum, my message to John Swinney and the SNP government is this: you lost, get over it, and let us all move on.
I now call on Anna Sarwar to speak to and move Amendment 14524.5 up to 6 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I move the amendment in my name. Can I start by saying that the contribution we got right from the start from the First Minister was all focused on the past. What I want to do is focus on Scotland today and the Scotland of the future. Because I've come directly today from a conference on housing in Scotland, a conference that the First Minister pulled out of in order to hold this debate. And on his watch, Scotland is in the midst of a housing emergency, with rough sleeping persisting, a record number of children in temporary accommodation, homelessness at unacceptable levels, and the dream of home ownership unattainable for millions of Scots. That is a clear example of not successes but failures of almost 2 decades of SNP rule. So the question has to be asked, with housing fully devolved here in Scotland, what exactly has the SNP government been doing for the last 10 years since the independence referendum? And he said this morning, let me just say this and I'll take the First Minister's intervention. He said this morning that we need to move to focus on what we can do, not what we can't do. So what's this SNP government been doing for the last 10 years since 2014?
First Minister.
I'm grateful to Mr Sarwar for giving way. And what the Scottish Government has been doing since 2007 is building more affordable houses per head of population in Scotland than any other part of the United Kingdom. That is what the Scottish Government has been doing since 2007 and delivering 128,000 affordable homes. So perhaps Mr Sarwar would check his details and his facts before he poses the question to this Government of the issues that we've attended to when Labour members shout out to me, what emergency? We're focused on ensuring that we take the actions to improve the supply of housing. That's what this Government has done, and we're proud of the record that we've put in place.
Anna Sarwar.
So what did we declare a housing emergency for then, First Minister? Why then, in a conference of 250 leaders in the housing industry, did 247 of them put their hand up to say that the housing system is broken on this government's watch? Because what have they been doing for the last 10 years since 2014? And let's look at somewhere else where they have the full powers. Our NHS. On their watch, 1 in 6 Scots on an NHS waiting list, A&E in turmoil, and thousands of Scots being forced to go private for healthcare. So what have we been doing for the last 10 years since 2014? The SNP full powers over education and standards falling in our schools. And don't forget, it was this First Minister that tried to downgrade working-class kids during the pandemic when he pretends that child poverty is his great #1 mission. So what has this SNP government been doing for the last 10 years since 2014? They have full powers over justice. And our prison services are at breaking point. We have soaring court backlogs and our prisons are over capacity. So what has this SNP government been doing in the last 10 years? And when it comes to the national scandal that is drug and alcohol deaths, when we have record levels of drug deaths and alcohol deaths going up in the last year, what has this SNP government been doing for the last 10 years since that referendum? Presiding Officer, the list of SNP failure after SNP failure goes on with working Scots paying the price of their incompetence. And the truth is, The reason why we made so little progress over the last 10 years is because this SNP government has been leading a campaign, not a government. And they've been trying to hide their failures behind the smokescreen of the Constitution. And on their watch, regardless of whether you voted yes or no, your bills are going up. Regardless of whether you voted yes or no, you're stuck on an NHS waiting list. Regardless of whether you voted yes or no,
let's hear Mr.
standards are falling. Regardless of whether you voted yes or no, businesses are shutting down. Regardless of whether you voted yes or no, opportunities for young people are being squandered. Regardless of whether you voted yes or no, you have a First Minister who'd rather laugh at the people of Scotland rather than do the important work in government. And no wonder he wants to spend all his time focusing on the past, because he wants to ignore the here and now. And let's talk about the future of Scotland and what it means for the people of Scotland. Nearly a decade.
Come on, colleagues. I think we can all agree that that is not appropriate. Let us hear Mr. Sarwar.
Presiding Officer, I know they've had lots of doom and gloom in the last 2 months, and so there's a constitutional debate to cheer up the backbenches today, so maybe that's why John Swinney's focusing on it. But let's look at what it means for people across Scotland. Nearly 2 decades of SNP and Tory failure, but unlike them, I am optimistic about the future for Scotland. But that requires hard work to clean up the mess that's been left behind. Because over the last 17 years of this SNP government, every single institution in Scotland now weaker rather than stronger on their watch. So Scots don't want to hear about hypothetical debates about powers that the government doesn't have. They want to know what this government is going to do with the power it does have. Because this SNP used to focus on the future, but now firmly the party of the past, of failure, of decline, of incompetence and bad with your money. And now it's left to the Scottish Labour Party to lay out the positive vision for Scotland. And I truly believe there's nothing that Scotland can't achieve if we had 2 governments willing to work in the public interest and willing to put the people before party and campaigning. And that's why that important work has started, whether it be GB Energy, whether it be the New Deal for working people, whether it be a genuine living wage, whether it's a Scotland office selling brand Scotland to the world. And now people across Scotland can't wait for 2026, where we have an opportunity to bring together the talents of our people, our workers, our businesses, to actually deliver for the people of Scotland. 10 years ago, it used to be said by our opponents that we were the ones that were negative for Scotland. Today, it's them that are negative for Scotland and Labour that's positive for Scotland. And whilst they want to talk Scotland down, while they want to point somewhere else to blame somebody else, we're getting on with building a programme that delivers change for people right across our country.
Must conclude, Mr.
Because
Sarwar.
our country, and closing, Presiding Officer, our country can't wait for change. The people on the waiting lists can't wait for change. The young person struggling to get a job can't wait for change.
You must conclude.
So bring on 2026.
You must conclude. I now call on Ross Greer to speak to and move Amendment 14524.3. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I move the amendment in my name. 10 years ago today, I thought we would win. I worked for Yes Scotland, and at this point in the day I was coordinating our Get Out the Vote operation. We're making the decision round about now to start knocking on the doors of undecided voters, because it was clear Yes voters were going to the polls without the prompting of our activists. Now, clearly it wasn't to be, but the referendum was a life-changing experience for me, and I'm grateful in particular to Charlie-Anne Somerville for having given me that opportunity. The referendum was a life-changing experience for thousands of people across Scotland, though. For so many ordinary people, it was the first time that they felt genuinely politically powerful in their life. Politics was something that we were doing together as a nation. It wasn't something being done to the people by politicians. On the last Saturday of the campaign, I was at the top of Buchanan Street in Glasgow. Glasgow, of course, was on track to vote yes. And it wasn't an organised Yes campaign rally. People had simply come together in that shared sense of excitement and hope that something transformational was possible. It felt genuinely revolutionary. And I respect and I understand that being on the defensive isn't pleasant, and for many no campaigners it was a very different experience. But so much, I think, of the political and media scorn of the Yes movement was elitist. It was the self-appointed middle and upper middle class gatekeepers of public opinion who didn't like the fact that so many people across this country had found their voice and demanded that it should be heard and valued. There's a lot that I could reflect on about the referendum, the catastrophic failure of Yes Scotland leadership compared to the outstanding success of building a Yes movement in every corner of the country, the effect of the No campaign's Project Fear on vulnerable people, some of whom were so terrified they stocked up on tinned food, others were so offended they turned up at their nearest Yes campaign hub to volunteer. But there's one reflection that I want to focus on before looking to the future, and it's on the fact that for the first time in 2014, 16 and 17-year-olds had the opportunity to vote. I was proud before I worked for the Yes campaign to be an MSYP who led on that campaign for the Youth Parliament. All of the best debates I took part in during the referendum were in high schools. I remember one in particular where my opponent, the chair of the local Conservative Party, was railing about the fact that his children's cousins were English and they would become foreigners if Scotland voted yes. To which one girl in the audience put her hand up and said, "Hold on a minute, what's wrong with foreigners?" The best contributions that I felt were made to that campaign were made by Scotland's young people, and I think it's one of the greatest legacies of the referendum that votes at 16 was made permanent, and was made permanent by the unanimous decision of this Parliament. All parties, both sides of the debate, decided that we wanted to value the voice of young people on a permanent basis. Now, the last decade's only deepened my support and the Scottish Greens' support for independence and our commitment to achieving it. 10 years of Tory government, Brexit, Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, and now a Labour government, but no change from those Tory policies. Greens believe in independence for a simple reason. We think the best decision makers for Scotland are the people who live here. Independence is a means to an end, that end being a fairer, greener country. But it's worth it as an end in and of itself because it brings power closer to the people. The Green Amendment today speaks to our wider vision. In the UK, we have Westminster government of both parties prepared to spend north of £200 billion renewing their nuclear weapons arsenal. An independent Scotland can rid itself of these nuclear weapons and be a force for peace and global disarmament. Both Westminster parties are committed to Brexit, despite the immense economic harm and the lost rights and opportunities. An independent Scotland can rejoin the EU, regain those rights and opportunities. After 14 years of viciously racist Tory government, we now have a Labour government reopening detention centres for asylum seekers and boasting of mass deportations.
Pauline
Yes.
McNeill.
Thank you to Ross Greer for giving way, and I do very much respect his contribution. I always have respected people who have a different perspective than me. But is it not fair to say that even pro-Yes commentators said at 2014 that the failure to present an economic plan and the failure to be clear about the currency of an independent Scotland are the reasons in which independence in 2014 failed? Does the member accept that, and have you resolved that question?
I'm grateful to Pauline McNeill for the intervention, and I think the Yes campaign does need to reflect, even 10 years on, that the case that we need to make to persuade people in the future does need to improve, and yes, it needs to improve on the economic answers. But the No campaign shouldn't avoid the fact that their argument was to stick with the status quo where 1 in 4 children in Scotland lived in poverty, largely as a result of the policies of successive UK governments, both Labour and Conservative. But on that point about asylum seekers, independence would give us the opportunity to treat asylum seekers with dignity, to recognise the huge privilege of being a country that can offer people safety and sanctuary. In the UK, the richest 50 families own more wealth than half of the population, 34 million people. And independent Scotland can fairly tax the unbelievable wealth hoarded by a tiny number, and we can fund climate action, we can end child poverty, we can deliver good quality public services. And of course, independence offers us the opportunity to ask fundamental questions about our constitution. Do we want to continue with the unelected privilege of monarchy, or become a modern democratic republic where the people choose their national leaders? The Scottish Greens believe that this isn't as good as it gets for Scotland. We can be a fairer, greener nation with the powers of a normal independent country. The challenge for our movement, the independence movement now, is to sell the why of independence, not the how, not to talk about process. The challenge for our opponents, I think, is a simpler one. It's to be honest. Be honest about the fact that you are denying the people of Scotland their democratic wishes through successive elections, or to be clear about how you believe we can collectively exercise our right to self-determination. Presiding Officer, in closing, it is useful to look back, but it's more important today to look forward. And I look forward to the day that this country puts its future in its own hands, as the Scottish Parliament will vote for this afternoon.
Thank you. I now call on Alex Cole-Hamilton to speak to and move Amendment 14524.2 up to 6 minutes.
Thank you very much indeed, Presiding Officer, and I move the amendment in my name. Presiding Officer, I remember days as my early days as an MSP in this chamber, when events like this, speeches like this, and debates like this would effectively be big marquee events. The chamber would be full, the government benches would certainly be full, the public gallery would be full, and yes, the columnists and scribblers and broadcast journalists would be packing out the press gallery. Not even the hard-bitten columnists of the National are here today. Such is the level to which this issue has now been plunged into deep freeze, and I think evidence of the end to our rhetorical wars of independence, and I am glad of it, because there are better things we can be doing with our time in this chamber. Presiding Officer, Winston Churchill once said that the definition of a fanatic is someone who can't change their mind and is unwilling to change the subject. And we will see in the tenor of the debate from the government and Green benches today the measure of the fanaticism in those parties. I wish they would change the subject, because there are so many topics crying out for this Parliament's attention and for parliamentary time. It's a rare thing. I wish the government would make time available for things like the crisis in accessing primary care and GP appointments at the first time of asking, the lack of dentists providing NHS care in our constituencies, the sewage flowing into our rivers from the government-owned water company, the mental health crisis which sees young people with suspected ADHD waiting in a waiting list for 7 years, the missed climate targets, the drug death emergencies, the 170,000 Scots currently battling long COVID. And, Presiding Officer, you will remember that this is the government that made twice as much money available for a referendum on this topic that didn't happen as have done for the whole of the sufferers of long COVID in this country. It is a national outrage. This is how Liberal Democrats would choose to influence government time. And there's every sign and every indication, if we are going to be part of what's next, that we will have more influence, and I am glad of that. But the SNP have spent the last 10 years picking at the scab of their defeat. It colours everything we do in this place. There are warning lights blinking across the dashboard of public policy crying out for ministerial attention, but they are wanting it. It explains why there are now 8 times as many Liberals on the Green benches of the House of Commons in Westminster as there are nationalists, and why we in this party came within touching distance of the number of Scottish MPs returned to Westminster. I came back from Brighton yesterday with a buoyant conference with 72 new Lib Dem MPs focused on the people's priorities, what we should be discussing in this place. And I go back to the general election because that was an important line in the sand. I think for the first time in a while, the SNP were humbled. They could no longer defy the laws of political gravity. Far from being the de facto referendum that they had set out initially to make it, the people rendered their judgment. They were not interested in having that discussion. Yes, Presiding Officer, the polls, any given poll that you look at this week, last week, or any week for the last 10 years, show that the public we represent is largely evenly divided, or as divided as it was, on the topic of independence as they were in 2014. But the salience has fallen away to almost nothing. Because if you ask people what motivates your vote, they will tell you it's about health, it's about the cost of living, it's about heating your home or your children's education, which has fallen under this government. They take far greater priority. It's a bit like saying, do you believe in God? Everyone's got a view about that, but it doesn't motivate how you vote, and nor too does the Constitution. And thank goodness that this 10-year anniversary will bookend a topic that has stifled our democracy, where every election up till this general election has been wrapped in a flag, based on a reductive calculation as the best way to have a referendum or the only means of stopping one. I am glad of it. We'll hear a lot about Brexit. We've already heard a lot about Brexit, but the SNP were latent converts to that cause, to the cause of European unity. And in fact, the SNP spent more losing the Shetland by-election to the Liberal Democrats than they did on the entirety of the Remain campaign in 2019. I'm going to make some progress. I'll come back to you later. But Remain voters will find out.
Let's hear Mr. Cole-Hamilton.
And, Presiding Officer, we know from that recent history of that divisive referendum what happens when you offer people a proposition in the blind. that we were told the full sum total of the Brexit campaign on the back end of the bus. The White Paper didn't have a great deal more to it. And actually, when that meets the reality, when that connects with real life, I'll take an intervention from Alistair Allen.
Alistair Allen.
The member for giving way. Can you just clarify, any time soon in government, are the Lib Dems planning to rejoin the European Union?
Alex Cole-Hamilton.
Well, we're not actually in government right now, but we certainly have a clearer roadmap back towards European integration than the SNP do, and Remain voters know that, because the SNP know that trying to rejoin the independent or join the European Union as an independent country would take years and austerity on stilts. That wasn't my words, that was their own fiscal commission, their own economic growth commission pointed that out. But, presiding officer, when we have that reality, as we did with Brexit, there are sacrifices and there are barriers, and Remainers understand that too. I will conclude by saying this. For too long we have talked about this. While matters of great importance to the people in this country idle, Lib Dems believe in togetherness, in internationalism, in Scotland's place in a reformed, united and federal United Kingdom. I am glad that 10 years ago we voted to remain in this family of nations. Let this afternoon, we indulge this failing government in its obsession and in its fanaticism be the very last one we do so in this chamber. Thank you.
Thank you. I now call on Ash Regan to speak to and move Amendment 14524.1 up to 6 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I move the amendment in my name. So it's 10 years from the momentous day when real power shifted to the people of Scotland. On September the 18th, 2014, for 15 hours, Scotland's future was truly in Scotland's hands. That event energised Scotland, but since the polls have closed and the results fell short, what has happened to that energy that brought 84% of Scotland out to vote? So since then, we've had 4 UK general elections. 1 even sent 56 SNP MPs to settle up. We've had 2 Scottish Parliament and 2 Scottish Council elections, a European election, an EU referendum, and countless by-elections. We've endured 6 UK Prime Ministers. We've had 4 Scottish First Ministers and even 11 leaders of the Scottish Labour Party. Time really has passed, because one of the 2 ferries that was ordered in 2014 is now actually floating. We've had more SNP manifesto promises with matching mandates than you can shake a stick at, yet here we still are, wringing our hands in despair at the inevitable mismanaged decline of a UK that is still trying to convince itself that it is still functioning. My point, Presiding Officer, is this: a generation has unquestionably passed. Now, the people of Scotland watching at home must be wondering what work has been done to enable us to answer some of those big questions, not just those from 2014, but of Scotland's future in 2024 and beyond. Things like currency, pensions, borders, immigration, economy and so on. But once the people had gifted this government the power, they largely forgot about independence. Aside from a brief paper exercise, independence was irrelevant to them, and running a devolved ship took their attention and became their priority. And they were too much focused on playing whack-a-mole with what they describe as the big issues of the day. Yet for 10 years, it was nearly impossible for this government to answer the most basic of questions: what is a woman? We've now answered that for them in this chamber. Self-ID is not the law, and a woman is, and always will be, an adult human female. Why have they been missing in action, though? Declaring everything to be world-leading and chasing down magical progression points like they're on I'm a Celebrity bush tucker tiles, rather than actually delivering, demanding and demonstrating that the best Scotland for the people is here, the one where we remove the walls of devolution and chart a new course of self-determination. In the absence of the government making the weather and answering the big questions of 2014, the grassroots movement has stepped up. And it's time to harness that talent across Scotland and, again, unite to bring groups like the Common Weal, the Scottish Currency Group and Believe in Scotland into the light. Only our collective effort can make a real difference. I will.
Jamie Green.
Can I thank the member for taking intervention? At the last general election, her party achieved under 12,000 votes across the whole of Scotland. How much influence does she think her party really has in this debate?
Ash Regan.
Well, surely any speaker that has a seat in this Parliament is entitled to put forward their suggestion for how we should go forward, and that's what I am intending to set out here. Now, nothing quite says self-determination like putting the question of independence into the hands of the British Supreme Court. That predictably British answer to the ill-fated attempt to do something without thought to the next steps disabused many trusting independent supporters of the illusion of a secret plan. I'm not too sure what we expected when we had to board our British Airways flight to go down to the British non-ministerial government department, the British Supreme Court, which sat in London and gave a judgment under a British flag, swearing an oath to a British Queen. So we've heard what the British think, and now it's time to listen to the people of Scotland. Now, I want to maintain the spirit of the referendum, in which everyone came together. We put our differences aside for independence. And as members will know, I rarely agree with the Green Party on anything. And I don't fully agree with the motion, the amendment that they've put forward today, but I will support it as an addition to the toolkit for independence. The promised constitutional convention is well overdue, but the next best time for it is now. I will also support the government motion by the First Minister. And likewise, in the face of recurrent defeat, I have offered to support the upcoming budget based on mutual support for a policy endorsed by the SNP conference and included in the Scottish Government's strategic approach to prostitution. My unbuyable bill is definitely supportable. There are 3 pro-independence parties in this chamber, and if we start working on it today, we still have the time, we have the arithmetic to turn this ship around and achieve independence, because this Scottish Parliament is the voice of the Scottish people, and it can play a crucial role in our journey towards independence.
Thank you. We now move to the open debate, and I call Kevin Stewart to be followed by Annie Wells.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. 10 years ago, we proposed our path to creating a modern, diverse and dynamic Scotland, the path of independence. And we were told by the Better Together parties that we didn't need to leave Westminster, we could change Westminster. But within a heartbeat, Scotland's voice was silenced, and the next day the debate was all about votes for English laws, English votes for English laws. And we were told at that time that our hope would lead to Scotland leaving the European Union. But it was the campaign of fear that spawned the Brexit campaign of misinformation that ripped Scotland out of Europe against her will. We were told that our hope would lead to food costs skyrocketing and energy bills going through the roof. But that's exactly what Scotland has now, with many unable to afford the cereal that they told us to eat. They said our hope would crash the pound, hope would destroy the economy, hope would create a fiscal black hole. But it wasn't our hope that crashed the pound, it was Westminster's Liz Truss. It wasn't our hope that destroyed the economy, it was Westminster austerity. And it wasn't our hope that created the fiscal black hole, it was Westminster mismanagement. But 10 years later, Westminster has changed. Finally, after another decade of Tory misery, we have a Labour Prime Minister in number 10. And after 10 weeks of Labour change, The vow is now of more austerity and that things can only get worse. But some things haven't changed. The old Westminster politics of jobs for your mates and bungs from millionaires and billionaires is still alive and kicking. Presiding Officer, the key to creating a modern, diverse, dynamic Scotland is, quite simply, independence. But not just independence for Scotland, the nation, but independence for the people of Scotland. An independence built on freedom from soul-destroying poverty. A freedom from one allows you the personal independence of thinking where you will be tomorrow rather than how you will get through today. Thinking of where you will be tomorrow opens up the idea of who you will be tomorrow. Modern Scotland must be a nation of people with a personal independence that grows from the freedom of being who and what you are and knowing where you want to go. A nation of people comfortable in who they are, where they're going and how they're going to get there. A diverse nation working together as one. Many as one, but not of one mindset or one identity or having one way of doing things, and certainly not one group of people destined for the top by the colour of their school tie. The power of an independent Scotland will come from the hopes of independently minded Scots, and it is the unique perspectives of each Scot that will create a modern Scotland. Such uniqueness is enriched by a diversity of thoughts, views, perspectives and backgrounds, and encouraged by a culture of tolerance, respect and hope. Let us be clear that we have the people, the talent, the culture, the skills, the beauty, the natural resources, the institutions and the hope. We just need our independence. Thank you very much, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. And I call Annie Wells to be followed by James Dornan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. 10 years ago to the day, Scots were asked whether they wanted independence or if they wanted to remain a part of the United Kingdom. They went, they voted and they chose the Union. And you would think 10 years after Scotland voted decisively to remain within the UK, the SNP ministers may have finally learned to have moved on. Even if they didn't want to in their hearts, you'd think they'd realise they need to in their heads. But today's motion from the First Minister tells you everything you need to know. He represents a government that is so out of touch with the majority of Scots. In the years since, the push for another divisive independence vote have been continually pursued. This has been done so despite so many urgent matters needing the attention and funding that it consumed. After losing the first vote, the SNP looked forward to an independence bill to the Supreme Court, which was unanimously rejected by top judges. The SNP Scottish Government has spent more than £2 million on its obsession with independence, including 13 papers published on independence, and one of these was titled Independence in a Modern World. Presiding Officer, I do not believe there is anything modern or forward-thinking about repeatedly reopening the divisions of an independence vote that took place exactly a decade ago. Instead, I want to see the Scottish Government forgo all the wasted resources they have gone towards this and to have them redirected towards addressing the priorities of everyday Scots. Yes, of course.
Alistair on. For giving way, and I hear what she's saying, and I recognise and respect the fact that we come from different political stances on this. But is she saying that there is never going to be any legal way for people in Scotland to express their view again on the matter of independence, given that elections tend to suggest and opinion polls tend to suggest half the country wants that?
Annie Wells.
You lost the independence vote. You need to just deal with that and move forward. That's what we need to do in this Parliament. We need to deal with the things that I'm going to tell you that we need to deal with, that people are telling me we have to deal with. Creating a modern, diverse and dynamic Scotland requires addressing everyday issues of people across our nation. A summary of polling data from 2021, published by the Scottish Government, found that across all age groups, the economy and health consistently ranked as the top two priorities. On the topic of the economy, there is much to be desired, to put it mildly, when looking at the SNP's long record in government. The Scottish economy under their leadership has cost the budget £624 million. And if you don't take my word for it, this is the opinion of Graham Roy, who is the chair of the Scottish Fiscal Commission. And even more disappointingly, the Scottish National Investment Bank, itself established by the SNP, suffered pre-tax losses amounting to £14.6 million between April 23 and March 24, with a further £20.2 million loss the year before. And moving on to the second priority, health, the SNP have been unable to reach their own cancer treatment targets. This target is that 95% of patients referred with suspected cancer should begin treatment within 62 days of their referrals. The last time this was met by NHS Scotland was 2012. This is well before Brexit and well before the COVID-19 pandemic. Under the leadership of the SNP, NHS Scotland waiting lists have more than doubled over the course of the decade since 2014. At the end of June of this year, there were 714,000 people on waiting lists for new outpatient appointments or for inpatient day case appointments, as opposed to 313,000 in September 2024. And no conversation about health would be complete either without talking about the SNP's most shameful legacy of all, the drug death crisis. 21,965 drug and alcohol-related deaths have been recorded since 2014. Year after year, Scotland's reputation as the Western world's worst drug-related mortality is reaffirmed. How do those families feel about the SNP's claims of a modern, diverse and dynamic Scotland? And perhaps on the 10th anniversary of the 2014 independence vote, the Scottish Government should use this decisive moment to move on. To conclude, Presiding Officer, the Scottish independence cause was put to a vote exactly 10 years ago and Scots voted to keep the nation as part of the UK. Today's debate is dedicated to creating a Scotland fit for the future. To do so, I do not believe fixating on the past, especially on issues as decisive as independence, should be the answer, nor a key priority for any government. Instead, I implore the members of the SNP government to focus on addressing the issues that affect regular Scots and the plethora of issues that we currently face every day. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. I call James Dornan to be followed by Richard Leonard. Up to 5 minutes. Mr Dornan.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. It's always a pleasure to speak in the Chamber, and I'm delighted to get the opportunity to speak today on the 10th anniversary of the Scottish Independence referendum. A referendum where the people of Scotland had the opportunity to remind the world of what a diverse and dynamic country Scotland is. However, for various reasons, a fear of the unknown, the false promises of a better future, the continual lies and scaremongering from the no camp and many sections of the media, and in some cases a truly held belief in the benefits of being part of the UK, Scotland narrowly voted no. However, no matter how you voted, nobody can argue that it's been a tumultuous decade since that day, and I doubt anyone can honestly say that Scotland has benefited from that no vote in the referendum, despite what I'm sure, and we already have heard, the vehement protestations to the opposite from those benches. But how could you seriously believe otherwise? In those 10 years, Scotland has suffered from a Brexit that we voted against, a cost of living crisis that harms the most vulnerable in our society, deliberately inflicted through the policies of austerity, and an acceleration in the plundering of Scotland's natural resources to keep Britain afloat. Any of these factors taken in isolation would have been cause for putting the question to the people of Scotland again, but all of them combined make that case for a second referendum unanswerable. It's my continual hope, but sadly not my expectation based on what I've heard today, that UK politicians will soon embrace the concept of fairness and decency and realise that democracy is not an event, but a process. It's the right of all people to self-determination, and opinions can change markedly in 10 years. You don't think so? Then why is it that Northern Ireland has a political generation defined as 7 years? And if the polls in Northern Ireland showed the support for a referendum that recent Scottish ones had, then they would have triggered a border poll. A recent poll suggested an independent Scotland were to rejoin the EU, 56% would vote in favour of independence, compared to just 32% who would still vote no. This is the real reason the Unionists oppose another independence referendum. They are terrified they will lose, and they will lose, convincingly. Despite the ongoing misleading claims by our opponents, the Scottish Government has done much in the 10 years since the first independence referendum to help protect the people of Scotland against the worst of the Tory cuts from Westminster. The money spent in mitigation of Westminster's harsh and unfair policies has already been well highlighted. From the bedroom tax onwards, we spent around £1.2 billion mitigating the impacts of 14 years of harmful UK Government policies. This is money the Scottish Government could have spent on health, education or transport priorities, and it's been spent simply to stop the UK Government from harming Scotland's people. Imagine how much better we could do as a country and a society if this were no longer the case. UK Government decision to restrict winter fuel payments means a drop in the Scottish budget of around £160 million, whilst the Secretary of State for Scotland has coincidentally been given a budget of £150 million to spend on anti-poverty measures. In effect, are stripping pensioners of their winter heating money to attempt to provide Ian Murray a degree of relevance in the Scottish public discourse. But as shown by the most recent decisions by this quaintly named Labour Party, this is a drop in the ocean for the cuts coming down the line from them. Presiding Officer, has been shown already, we do things differently here in Scotland. Primarily, we value our public services and our NHS. But we are still hampered by successive UK governments, which often act contrary to the best interests of the people of Scotland. For example, do you believe for a second that in independent Scotland you would have seen the only oil refinery in the by far most oil-rich part of the UK being closed? And whilst Ireland, once part of this benevolent union, remember, has given every pensioner €1,000 to help with their winter fuel, Labour scrapped the winter payment for pensioners as prices rise here in the coldest part of the UK. In independent Scotland, we will treat our pensioners more like Ireland than the UK. But of course, if we really want to think about creating a modern, diverse and dynamic Scotland, independence is the only long-term answer. But don't just take my word for how successful we'd be. Just read the words of the Chief Executive of the CBI, who described Scotland's resources as the golden ticket for UK growth, highlighting that Scotland has the tools at its fingertips to be a global clean energy superpower. And that is undoubtedly true. But we won't be under this new government, led by a PM who's clearly shown already that his focus is in style over substance, happy to take money off of wains and pensioners while accepting huge donations from all sorts of people for all sorts of things. It really didn't take him long to become prime ministerial in the fashion of his recent predecessors. Presiding Officer, with independence, we would have a real opportunity to do things differently. We're an educated, industrious, modern nation which benefits hugely from its natural resources. However, until we unlock these UK shackles, we will never be able to show the world that, once again, Scotland is that diverse, dynamic, driving force for good that it once was.
Thank you. I now call Richard Leonard to be followed by Karen Adam. Up to 5 minutes. Mr Leonard.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Today, the SNP is using this Parliament to go through the motions and to reheat the old arguments. For all the talk of constitutional conventions and, rather bizarrely, the result of the 2026 Scottish Parliament regional list vote, which, in my view, is insulting the intelligence of the people of Scotland, nobody really believes there is any appetite now for another referendum. And yet the government asks us this afternoon to suspend reason and fall for the notion that a rerun referendum and resulting from that a victory for nationalism is the only way to win a modern, diverse and dynamic Scotland. Well, they are entitled to their opinion, but we are entitled to ours. I've never believed that the sky would fall in with an independent Scotland, and when people ask me if I am a nationalist or a unionist, I say that I'm neither. I'm a socialist. But neither have I ever believed that the real division in society is between Scotland and England. The real division is between those who, through their hard work and endeavour, create the wealth, and those who end up owning the wealth. That's the real division. And the truth is this. Under John Swinney and Kate Forbes' independent Scotland, there would be no redistribution of wealth and no redistribution of power. The same people would still be in charge. Jim Ratcliffe will still be in control of Grangemouth, still holding the government to ransom, or, as we saw just last week, ignoring it completely. Today, the First Minister tells the party faithful that he wants to concentrate on what he can do and not on what he cannot. But his problem is this. This SNP government has been in office now for 17 years. After 17 years in charge of land reform, what is modern, diverse and dynamic about Scotland's feudal pattern of land ownership? Half of our land is still owned by just 343 wealthy individuals, aristocrats and not-so-noble families. What is modern, diverse and dynamic about a Scotland which denies the dignity of migrant workers from Central Asia, working on Scotland's farms, who I met with over the summer, exploited, living in inhumane accommodation on Scotland's farms today and tonight? What is modern, diverse and dynamic about that? Just a few days ago, in the programme for government, the government said it wanted, and I quote, a stronger inclusive economy, tackling inequalities faced by women and marginalised groups, helping people into work and supporting diverse businesses. So why is it that actions taken directly by the Scottish Government and by the NHS under the Scottish Government's direction are threatening 60 jobs at Haven, a supported business in Larbert, which provides useful work for people with disabilities? If this factory isn't part of an inclusive economy, I don't know what is. And I'm sure that the First Minister will recall that this was a factory back in 2015 which he himself opened. So let this Parliament hear about the conditions people are living in now, not independence in the abstract, but the independent living of those magnificent workers today. And so, as part of his reawakening, I say to the First Minister, as you wake from your slumbers, step in and halt these redundancies. Far from being modern, diverse and dynamic under the SNP, control over the economy has been confined to investment through foreign direct investors, multinational corporations. Look at the ScotWind licensing round. Look at the private equity-owned tax avoidance scheme providers who the Scottish National Investment Bank is lending public money to. I sincerely believe that the answers to the great challenges we face, inequality, poverty, the extreme imbalance in the distribution of wealth and power, nuclear disarmament, the climate crisis, the answers do not lie in nationalism or patriotism, but in a socialism which has democracy as its essence and humanity at its centre. And I say this to my own party too. It's not just where the powers lie, it's what you intend to do with them, for what purpose and in whose interests. That's the real test of any political party which stands for change, and for me that means how do we secure not just a politics but an economy which is of the people, by the people, for the people. Thank you.
Thank you. I now call Karen Adam to be followed by Sarah Boyack. Up to 5 minutes, please, Ms Adam.
Thank you. Presiding Officer, when I've popped my head into my son's bedrooms and I've heard accents from around the globe, places like the United States, all over Europe and Asia, all coming together, connected by a community that they have built online. They live in an online world that is international, inclusive and full of global-reaching possibilities. But every time I do hear those voices, I'm reminded that my children are growing up in a smaller, more insular version of a Brexit Britain, disconnected from the opportunities and relationships that once felt within reach. And it's an international embarrassment. This was not the future I fought for back in 2014. I was a stay-at-home mum. My daughter was older and up and left home at that point, but I was still juggling 5 neurodiverse sons and volunteering in my community. I wasn't a politician, but I was someone who cared deeply about what kind of Scotland my children were going to inherit. As the independence referendum approached, I was appalled by the negativity of the No campaign, and I think we can see some of that reflected today. I just couldn't understand why anyone would think we weren't capable of standing on our own 2 feet. The implication that we needed outside help to succeed, well, that insult really stuck with me. And it wasn't just me, it offended so many others who knew that our nation's potential was far greater than the fearmongers who would have us believe. Since then, the UK government built nothing but a house of cards. Meanwhile, over the past 10 years, we've seen what the SNP government has done with our limited powers of devolution. They've built our house upon a rock, laying the foundations of a better, fairer Scotland through policies like the Scottish Child Payment, lifting thousands of children out of poverty, protecting free university tuition, free prescriptions, free personal care, building a social security system from scratch, rooted in dignity, fairness and respect. These were not just policies, these were acts of resilience, preparing us for the storms ahead, the storms that we face now. The decision to pull us out of the European Union, a decision that Scotland did not make, brought chaos to our economy. Tory austerity, now Labour's, has eroded our public services and left families struggling. But because we built those foundations, because we used our devolved powers wisely, we've been able to shelter our people from the worst of it. Yet we can only do so much. It's Westminster's choices that have driven up the cost of living, decimated our ties with Europe and plunged Scotland into uncertainty. But let's be clear, this is not where our story ends. Yes, I will.
I thank the member for taking an intervention. She claims it's it's Westminster that has resulted in the cost of living crisis. Does she not agree with me that maybe Ukraine had something to do with it? That maybe a pandemic had something to do with it? Karen Adam, 17 years of SNP.
I do thank the member for that intervention. And here's the deal with this. You know, we're told in one hand that the union is there to help and support us, and they have those broad shoulders. Where have those broad shoulders been? Slopey, more like. No, I've taken enough. Scotland has the potential to be a global leader in renewable energy. We're generating over 113% of our electricity needs from renewable resources. But once again, those ties to the union hold us back. Instead of being rewarded, we're actually penalised. We pay higher transmission charges to access the UK's grid, an injustice that holds us back from fully capitalising on our green energy potential. But let's not just talk about economics. It's about the kind of society we want to be, a future where no matter your background, culture or identity, you can live freely and without fear, where we can dismantle the barriers of ignorance that hold so many back, and where we can build a nation rooted in fairness and opportunity for all. 10 years on, I'm now a grandmother and often see the world through my posterity's eyes. The opportunities of a global community, an open, dynamic future for Scotland. 60% and over of our young people support independence because they understand that it's not just necessary to control our own future, but it's actually normal. And with that stat, we can see that it's no longer a question of if, and they don't like to hear it, but it's when. Our young people are leading the way, showing us that Scotland's future lies beyond the limitations of this union. And they are ready for a Scotland that's confident, outward-looking and free to make its choices on the world stage. Presiding Officer, Scotland has the resources, we have the talent and the determination to succeed. The SNP government has shown time and time again that even with the limited powers we have, we can create positive change. Imagine what we could achieve with the full powers of independence. We're not saying that we're going to be perfect. There are no countries that are perfect. We are saying that we deserve to control what we do in our country that we live in and have a chance to flourish. Thank you.
We are already running over time. Members will need to stick to their time allocations. I call Sarah Boyack to be followed by Pam Gosal. Up to 5 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. When this Parliament started 25 years ago, we had a great vision. for Scotland, a parliament where parties could work together to serve the people of Scotland and, as Richard Leonard said, tackle the deep-seated inequalities that hold people and communities back and build a brighter future for Scotland. And as a member first elected in 1999, I've seen the Parliament take great strides forward, but I've also seen it paralysed, and I've seen where our constituents urgently need change and it doesn't happen. And in a way, that's why this debate and the last 17 years have been so frustrating, because the SNP government has wasted the time and resources of Parliament to push the agenda of independence when it was rejected by the public in Scotland. And we did have a big debate, but it was also rejected 10 years later in the general election in 2024. It wasn't people's priorities. And in a poll yesterday, it showed that even more people are against independence than a decade ago. No, thank you. So it's really frustrating, because we're getting people talking down the powers of this Parliament that we should be using now to support our constituents. Now, there's things that we could do. For example, when we first established the Parliament, Labour committed to working towards a 50-50 Parliament in gender representation from day one. And there's still a lot of work to do, but I'm proud that we are now the largest cohort of female MSPs yet in Holyrood. Yet the issue of childcare, the issue of our kids getting education in school that fails them, that came up time and time again in the general election campaign. And we've got the privilege to deliver change in here, but we're not using it enough. I did the first 2 national parks, free bus travel for the over 60s in Scotland, new active travel, railway line investment, but we're going into reverse. The loss of bus services right across Scotland, getting rid of peak fares in ScotRail, that just stops people being able to afford or have low-carbon transport options. And that's at a time when we need to tackle air quality and the climate emergency. So yes, the title of this debate is crucial, but we're in danger of wasting the resources in Scotland unless we get serious about what we need to do to build a diverse, dynamic country. Take our culture and the arts. We've everything from the biggest arts festival in the world to grassroots event and organisations in neighbourhoods right across the country. It's something we can rightly celebrate. But we could lose talent, investment, international recognition if we don't see the Scottish Government giving it clear, consistent support every year. And nowhere is Scotland's potential more evident than the exciting future of green energy, which has just been mentioned by Karen Adam. We've got a talented workforce with transferable skills, but not the offshore skills passport. We've got fantastic opportunities with our natural resources on land and offshore, technological innovation driven by our higher education sector and businesses. So huge opportunities. But we're not getting the progress we need because the planning system is not efficient, it's not properly resourced, and it means that people are having to wait not just months, but years. The investment is ready. It must not be blocked or endlessly delayed because, like the ScotWind project, there was a huge amount of resource that has been removed. And that means supply chains aren't going to get the investment. It means the confidence isn't there. And it means we're not getting the training opportunities that people need now because we've got the skills, but we don't have the jobs. And our newly elected Labour government has started delivering, setting up GB Energy, creating the National Wealth Fund that will deliver and make sure we get the investment we urgently need in our ports across Scotland. There is a huge amount we can do. NHS, education, housing, transport, all areas that the Scottish Parliament is responsible for, but there's close to breaking point. And our remarkable potential as a country is being squandered. Scottish Labour's got a vision for Brand Scotland, present the very best of our country to the rest of the world and support our economy. We can be a leader in renewables. We can be one of Europe's leading artistic hubs. And we've got industries that are the envy of the world and a dedicated workforce. Think about our fantastic food and drinks industry, our beautiful natural environment that can fuel a tourism industry to bring benefits to local communities right across the country. We can build a modern, diverse and dynamic Scotland to tackle the deepening social inequalities and our climate emergency. But to do that, we need to seize the opportunity with both hands, use all the levers available to us, a party to focus on the day job, not using the Constitution as an excuse, and And in the last few weeks, we've seen the difference Labour is making. Cooperative, constructive engagement between governments, respect. So I agree the Scottish Parliament should be working towards building the future, but it will take Scottish Labour to make that a reality.
Thank you. I now call Pam Gosal to be followed by Jackie Dunbar. Up to 5 minutes, Ms Gosal.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. When I first read the title of this debate, I thought this would be a debate about diversity, how it can help create a modern and dynamic Scotland. As the first Indian woman and the first Sikh elected to the Scottish Parliament, I was excited to speak about the contributions that different ethnic minorities bring to Scottish society and how they help Scotland thrive. However, when I saw the motion, I was disappointed. The SNP government has chosen to hijack this important issue to talk about one thing and one thing only: independence. No surprise there. On this day, 10 years ago, Scotland overwhelmingly voted to stay in the United Kingdom. Yet 10 years later, the SNP are unable to let go. This obsession with the Constitution means that important issues like the economy, education, health and many more have taken a back seat. So let me remind the SNP government of some of their 17 years of so-called accolades, or should I say failures. The SNP have presided over financial mismanagement, from ferries that don't float to doomed legal battles, with most striking the legal battle on the Gender Recognition Reform Bill. If the SNP had their way, and if it were not for the previous UK Conservative government, men would be able to legally be recognised as women by simply declaring it. Just a month after this vote, a convicted rapist was transferred to women's prison, with the First Minister at the time, Nicola Sturgeon, refusing to call him a man. Instead of learning their lesson, the SNP government wasted more than £200,000 of taxpayers' money in legal costs to defend this doomed bill. SNP ministers have chosen to punish hard-working Scots and businesses, and by making Scotland the most highly taxed part of the United Kingdom. Most people here in Scotland pay higher taxes compared to their counterparts in the rest of the United Kingdom, thanks to the SNP tax rises. Anyone earning more than £28,850 is considered wealthy in the SNP Scotland. This includes nurses, police officers, teachers and so on. A recent report by the Fraser of Allender Institute found that nearly 2 in 3 firms have been affected by the SNP's income tax policy, as this has made it difficult for them to attract and retain staff. At the same time, the SNP government failed to pass on the 75% rate relief for businesses that the previous Conservative UK government provided for businesses. An educated workforce is key to growing an economy. Unfortunately, the SNP government has presided over cuts to further and higher education budgets, while the former Deputy First Minister announced the axing of at least 1,200 university places.
Ross Greer.
Thank you, and I'm grateful to the member for taking an intervention. I'm just wondering where she would have laid the cuts from the Conservatives' tax policy, because, of course, if we'd followed Conservative advice on setting Scotland's income tax rates, our public services would be worse off to the tune of £1.5 billion. Would that have been in the education sector? Would that have been the health service? Would that have been our courts? Where would Pam Gosal have made those cuts?
Pam Gosal.
I thank the member for that intervention. To be honest, let's be very clear here. Maybe you didn't listen to what I said. Financial mismanagement. That's where you would get the money from. I hope Ross Greer would take some accountancy advice from me, who has ran businesses and actually knows where money comes from and when money goes out. Scotland's schools have suffered under 17 years of the SNP government, with an attainment gap widening, with poor results in international maths, reading and science tests, and an increase of violence in schools. Speaking of violence, the SNP's government's soft-touch approach to justice has made Scotland a more dangerous place. Police officer numbers are their lowest since the SNP came to power, and crime has risen 17% since 2014. Despite this, the SNP chose to release hundreds of dangerous prisoners early. Last but not least, I would like to talk about the issue of health. Since the 2014 referendum, NHS waiting lists have more than doubled, while the SNP have yet to meet their cancer treatment targets. In addition to all this, Scotland remains the drugs death capital of Europe. In closing, Presiding Officer, it is therefore clear that if an independent Scotland is anything like the 17 years of the SNP government, it would be one of incompetence and stagnation. If the SNP are ever serious about creating a modern Scotland, then they should stop fixating on independence and instead focus on tackling the problems that they have presided over.
Thank you. I now call Jackie Dunbar, who is the final speaker in the open debate, after which we will move to closing speeches. Jackie Dunbar, up to 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Ahead of the referendum, the Yes campaign ran an advert that began with, "Hi, my name is Kirsty, and I'm going to be born on the 18th of September 2014, the very same day as the referendum on independence for Scotland. The question is, what kind of country will I grow up in?" Today is Kirsty's 10th birthday, and we have a chance to look back on the country that she has grown up in. Is it a Scotland that is fairer, more prosperous? A Scotland where she's been able to reach her full potential? A Scotland of opportunity? Is it a Scotland where our wealth and natural resources are in Scotland's hands, harnessed to help everyone in Scotland prosper? Presiding Officer, let me tell you a little bit about how Kirsty is getting on. Before her first birthday, the UK elected a Tory government that had a majority across the UK, but just one single MP in Scotland. That meant her early years were marked by austerity. When she was 1, the UK voted to leave the EU, despite a majority of voters in every single Scottish local authority voting to remain. In the years that followed, Kirsty started school in one of the over 1,000 schools that have been built or upgraded under this government, and her little brother and sister were born. Kirsty was delighted when the baby boxes arrived. They meant her siblings would get the best possible start in life, and of course she could help colour them in. Then, the world changed with the pandemic. It took a wee while, but things slowly started to go back to normal, or the new normal. Kirsty went back to school, although she had to wear a mask, and some of her friends had moved away due to Brexit. Her siblings started nursery, benefiting from the 1,140 hours of free childcare. Presiding Officer, Kirsty's world changed again when her dad got ill and lost his job, and it's here we have a tale of two governments. Kirsty's parents didn't get universal credit for Kirsty's younger sister because of the two-child cap. In the years that followed, the family's gas and electricity bills started to go up, followed by the cost of food, then their mortgage payments. At 8 years old, Kirsty didn't understand what was happening. What she did know was that the house was colder and darker, and that she wasn't getting new clothes or toys anymore, and her parents always looked worried. There was still some help for Kirsty and her family from the Scottish Government, however. Her parents received the Scottish Child Payment for Kirsty and both her siblings. They received Best Start grants when her brother and sister started school, along with school clothing grants at the start of every school year, and got support with bills through the Home Heating Support Fund and the Scottish Welfare Fund when times were tight. When her dad got better and was able to get back to work, he was able to get a job that paid the real living wage. He now pays less income tax than elsewhere in the UK under Scotland's more progressive taxation system. Kirsty and her siblings get free bus travel. They get free entry to national museums and galleries. At school, they get 2 hours a week of PE and free music lessons. At just 10 years old, Kirsty is still a child, and her whole future is still ahead of her. As things stand as she gets older, Kirsty will benefit from free period products. When she turns 16, she'll start to get to shape this country, her country, at the ballot box. If she goes to university in Scotland, she won't have to pay a penny in tuition fees. As Kirsty grows, she will decide what she does for work, whether to have a family, making her own decisions and writing her own story. And what will Scotland look like when we get to that point? Will we be an independent country, able to see decisions about Scotland made in Scotland? Will we be writing our own story, our own history? I continue to campaign tirelessly for independence because I believe it will give us a better Scotland for all who live here. In the decades since the referendum, this Parliament, often working across party lines, has put in place measure after measure to help build a better future for the next generation, but keeps getting undermined by Westminster austerity. I believe all of us want to see a fairer Scotland, a more prosperous Scotland, a modern, diverse, dynamic Scotland, a Scotland where Kirsty and all our bairns can reach their full potential. And the question for folk up and down our country today is simply, do they feel that it is more likely in a nation that decides for itself? I believe it does.
Thank you. We now move to closing speeches. I call first Ash Regan. Up to 6 minutes, Ms Regan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In 2014, the royal family, including Will, Kate, Harry, Meghan, they were all in the news. The Commonwealth Games was being held in Glasgow, and the world was reporting a possible Trump presidency. Well, Presiding Officer, I'm almost scared to turn around in case Bill Murray is in the gallery, rebooting Groundhog Day, because 10 years later, a new generation of the royal family is in the news, the Commonwealth Games are returning to Glasgow, and an older, if not wiser, Donald Trump is again campaigning to be president. And yet, the only thing not to be repeated is a new democratic event in order for Scots to choose independence. But it's time to break out of that repeating Groundhog Day cycle and that ask the British, get refused, and put the question back to the people of Scotland by using what has been staring us in the face for 10 years, the ballot box. So let's hold the Constitutional Convention, let's assemble the Independence Commission and put democracy back in top gear in 2026 by putting independence to the people on the ballot. Self-determination is the path to beginning our empowered future, and a simple majority of pro-independence votes on the Scottish parliamentary list vote will trigger clear instructions from the people needed to demonstrate that democratic authority for Scottish independence. Now, I can't say that it's been a very enlightening debate this afternoon, Presiding Officer, but at least we did find out that Alex Cole-Hamilton is in a very buoyant mood after a recent visit to Brighton. But I would caution the member that using names like fanatics and fanaticism does let him down. There is nothing strange, there is nothing unusual about believing strongly in the human right to self-determination. Richard Leonard, if I'm quoting him correctly, he said that using the 2026 list vote was an insult to the people of Scotland. But I don't agree with that. The people of Scotland do not agree with that. And just last week, there was a poll showing that 57% of the Scottish public thought we should have another referendum. So the Labour Party, and indeed the Conservative Party, must say why they are willing to prevent Scots from having their say. Which brings me on to the Greens. Ross Greer, and I don't say this very often, Ross Greer hit the nail on the head when he spoke of denying Scots democratic wishes. And that is where we do have this deep issue, because not one, Presiding Officer, not one of the Labour, the Tory or the Liberal Democrat speakers addressed themselves to this fundamental question. If an SNP mandate after mandate did not secure a second referendum, then how can Scotland express its choice? What is the democratic route that is open to Scotland. And I'm still waiting to hear, perhaps I will hear an answer to that question in the summing up from the Unionist parties. I think now it's time to say goodbye to this unfunctional union and embrace the untapped potential of an independent Scotland. Knowing that the union's greatest fear is us firing on all cylinders with the Scottish Parliament's full powers and the backing of the Scottish people. Column inches have been padded out in recent years by how vicious, how detailed and incisive our fury has been with each other. Well, hopefully they've seen nothing like what is about to be unleashed by the union if we can all work together. We are, of course, a resource-rich nation, and our people deserve so much better than surviving through this UK-managed decline. We're abundant with the resources and the talents that we need to thrive under self-determination. No individual can change Scotland. Only a collective effort will deliver the Scotland for all of us that we want to see. So I'd urge us to set aside our differences and work together towards a common goal, our nation's independence. The independence phoenix, I believe, can rise from the ashes, and it will burn brighter and stronger than the fuel of our collective experience. We are taking this fight up a notch to match our rising ambition. We are discussing big ideas and bold promises, and I believe that the people's voice and their vote matters. The people of Scotland are sovereign, and only they will decide when it is time to reject Westminster's decline and chart a new course into the safety of independence.
Thank you very much. If I could encourage those, particularly sitting at the back of the chamber, to stop with the private conversations or to take them outside the chamber. And with that, I call Willie Rennie up to 6 minutes, please.
I want to pay tribute to all those who were involved in the independence referendum 10 years ago. Democracy thrives through the active support of volunteer campaigners who put aside their own spare time for the aid of democracy. But I want in particular to pay tribute to the late Alistair Darling, because the contribution that he made during that campaign, sacrificing years of his life for his country, I think is commendable, and our country is poorer for his loss. Ross Greer was right at the beginning. There was a division in the country. Some people felt that the campaign was a joyful, positive experience, liberating, many people thought. For others, it was oppressive. It was division. It meant disagreements with their family and their friends. Some relationships have never been repaired as a result of that. But I accept that some people were lifted up. But what I found most difficult during that campaign was the inference, sometimes being bluntly told, that because I didn't support independence, that somehow I didn't support my country. Now, I'm as Scottish as any nationalist in the country. I was born in Fife. In fact, I was born in Perth, but I've lived in Fife all of my life. And I regard myself as Scottish. And I think everybody who chooses to live in this country should be valued in the same way. But there was an inference that because I didn't support the particular policy advocated by those who supported independence, that somehow I wasn't loyal to my country. And I hope there was a bit of that coming out today. I hope that the SNP and the Nationalists do reflect on that in the future, because it proves to alienate people who might otherwise be persuaded to their cause, that if they continue along that line of thinking. Sarah Boyack was bang on, talking about the powers of this Parliament and how some are choosing to talk down the powers of the Parliament. I'm a proud member of this Parliament. I love being in this place. I think the opportunity that we get as members to influence the daily lives of people is fantastic. I mean, I will always look back on this time in Parliament as an opportunity and a privilege to be able to help people who are struggling with their mental health, or get them a warm home, or making sure they get an education that can lift them up and achieve great things in their life. But I'm also proud of the United Kingdom. I say proud of the United Kingdom, because although all countries have got their faults, the United Kingdom has done some bloody brilliant things. I mean, look at the fact that we founded the NHS. The international aid budget was one of the biggest in the world and has changed lives across the country. That's an immense...
Mr Rennie, I would just caution you in the language that you're using.
Okay. No, I will, President Officer. I do feel passionately, though, about the United Kingdom, and I think sometimes we are challenged to set out the positive case for the United Kingdom, and I think that's what I'm trying to do today. The soft power the United Kingdom has to influence different parts of the world, to prove on a different tack from what they're going on just now. And the fact that those people in England who stood up against the racists and the thugs who sought to exploit the attacks in Southport, I'm proud of those people. I think they did great things, and I think we should all be proud of them, and that's why I'm proud of the United Kingdom. But I've also, therefore, got enough confidence to talk about the reform of the United Kingdom, because although I think it's done some great things, I think it needs to change, just like I think this place needs to change. And that's why I was at the forefront of advocating through the Smith Commission and the Calman Commission more powers on tax and social security, which is often not recognised now that those significant powers with multi-billion-pound budgets were transferred to this institution. But I also want to change the United Kingdom. When I want to change the House of Lords and voting system, I also want to change towards a federal structure. All those things I think we can believe in while still believing in this institution. Now, it's not often said that Ash Regan is right, but she was right today that the arguments about independence have not moved on. There isn't really an attempt by those who believe in independence to make the case on the currency or on debt or on oil and gas or even on the EU, which they believed was the silver bullet that would get them over the line to support independence. I think now people have judged if that's what change looks like, I don't think we're going to go for it. It's even more complicated now to envisage an independent Scotland trying to get into the European Union with 10 years outside the UK and outside the European Union because of the currency complications. All of that has never been addressed. There's no substantial debate about those things. So it's no surprise there's not been any move in public opinion. Then finally, Richard Leonard, in a typically passionate speech, said that the government were going through the motions today. And it does feel a bit like that. They had to have this debate. It was 10 years on. Their party expects it. The activists are still yearning for independence. But John Swinney knows that it's not a priority for the people in Scotland. He knows that because there was the general election in July that told him that. He knows that because he's knocked on lots of doors and people have told him that that's the case. So he knows that it's not a priority, but he's a prisoner of his party and the circumstances just now. I just hope we can move on from this rather humdrum debate this afternoon onto something that deals with the issues that I think we were elected in this Parliament to try and achieve. So the SNP have got a big question to answer. Do they carry on with debates like this, or do they listen to the people of Scotland? Thank you.
Thank you. There are still too many private conversations going on around the chamber, not just in the back row. I'd ask colleagues to cease, give due respect and consideration to the person who is speaking. And on this occasion, it is Lorna Slater. Up to 6 minutes, Ms Slater.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm really very much enjoying what I feel like is positive energy from the pro-independence benches here. It feels a bit like getting the band back together. Whereas from the unionist benches, we're hearing nothing but misery and grump. They're really grumpy and so negative. You wouldn't think they'd won, would you? Whereas Alex Cole-Hamilton, for example, mistakes enthusiasm and passion for fanaticism, and he doesn't want to hear another thing about Indy. I've got bad news for him about this evening's members' business. Well, we'll be doing this all over again. We had to go all the way to Willie Rennie's closing speech before we got a single unionist trying to say anything positive about the union. Everyone else has been saying how awful the current situation is from both sides of the chamber, but actually Willie Rennie was the first person to try and make a positive case for the union, and I think that's really telling. Douglas Ross, not a single argument in defence of the union, nothing positive to say, neither for Amana Sarwar, not a single defence of Brexit. But you guys think Brexit is great, right? I mean, even the Liberal Democrats would tie us to Brexit, to first past the post voting, to nuclear weapons. They're passionate that those things should stay in place. Please, yeah.
Willie Rennie.
I think we know who's been negative now, but nevertheless, Sarah Boyack actually made a very positive speech about the powers of this Parliament and the benefits to the United Kingdom. So I hope the member will recognise that.
Lorna Sleator.
Thank you, Willie Rennie. One of the things that I'm imagining is a modern country, and a challenge that Douglas Ross laid before us is to imagine Scotland as a modern country. It is very difficult to me to imagine Scotland as a modern country with a crumbling dinosaur of an institution like the House of Lords, unelected lords, including hereditary ones, and the anachronism of a hereditary monarchy. Modern dynamic nations have elected heads of state. Modern dynamic nations have written constitutions. Scotland cannot be that modern dynamic nation while we are changed to a UK that has an anarchic constitutional settlement. Anas Sarwar highlighted the housing emergency, so I look forward to his enthusiastic support of the Scottish Green policies on rent controls as those get brought toward Parliament. The Scottish Greens have a vision for an independent Scotland. An independent Scotland where we can tax extreme wealth to fund a compassionate social security net. Where we have a written constitution that sets out the values of our nation, what is protected, what our rights are, so that they cannot be prorogued by Boris Johnson and, depend on the character of goodness knows who Prime Minister might be elected, but are set out in writing and decided on by the people of Scotland at a constitutional convention, so that we have written into constitutional law what our rights and responsibilities as citizens are going forward. An independent Scotland with a fully democratic elected head of state. This is a vision that the Scottish Greens have. A democratic Scotland which would rejoin the EU, to reconnect those opportunities that our young people have lost to live, love, travel and study in Europe, to put back and undo that economic damage to our fishers, farmers, businesses and individuals from being cut off by a hard Brexit. How different might the independence referendum of 2014 have been if a hard Brexit had been what was on offer at the time? To get the nuclear weapons out of Scotland and to transform our economy into a greener and fairer one, taking full advantage of the economic levers that we currently lack in order to transform that economy and take best advantage of what's ahead of us. While I am no longer serving in the Scottish Government, something that I found every day in that job was you'd ask a question about, well, why can we do this? What about if we try that? How about if we take this forward? And in every instance, the answer was, no, that's not devolved. No, that's a reserve power. No, that will be interfered with by the Internal Markets Act. Over and over, we are limited in what we can do in Scotland by the vision and extent of what happens in Westminster. And there is an immeasurable amount of brass neck in this chamber from people talking about cuts in Scotland, from people talking about how the challenges in Scotland, for example, the performance of our NHS, without looking at how comparable regimes across the UK perform. Because we are part of this UK, and we are all part of the decisions that are therefore made at Westminster. And how each nation of the UK decides to take those forward and how things are different in Scotland is worth recognising. It is absolutely worth recognising the benefits that we get in Scotland in exchange for people who earn a bit more, paying a bit more. The First Minister listed them off in his speech, including things like the baby box, including things like free university tuition. If you add up all of those benefits, which benefit people across the spectrum, including the Scottish Child Payment, they mount up to building that fairer, greener country. And the Scottish Greens will continue to work for that. And you'll hear from me again in a few minutes in the members' debate after business. Thank you.
Thank you, Slater. I now call Neil Bibby up to 6 minutes. Mr Bibby.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This debate was titled Creating a Modern, Diverse, Dynamic Scotland. And as the First Minister said, I'm sure this is something that we all want to achieve, creating a future that embraces the aspirations of Scotland's people and harnesses our collective talents. But it's one thing to talk about that future and another to deliver it. That requires ambition, competence and an impatience for change. A focus on the future, not the past, as Anas Sarwar rightly said in opening. A focus on what's happening in 2024, not what might have been in 2014. But the last 10 years have been a lost decade spent largely doing exactly that. And on ambition, this government once again betrays its lack of ambition for Scotland in the second half of its motion. It perpetuates the myth that no good can happen until day one of Scottish independence, that the constitutional cul-de-sac is the only means to this end. We've heard that from SNP, Green and Alba members. But this contradicts three things. Firstly, it overlooks the vast potential we have to thrive right now with the powers we already have. Secondly, that this ambition for modernity, diversity, dynamism aligns entirely with the mission set by the new UK Labour government. And finally, it disregards the wishes expressed by the people of Scotland on how to reach that ambition at the recent general election and also 10 years ago today. A great many Scots made... Have we got time for an intervention?
You don't have additional time, Mr Bibby.
Okay. I'll make some progress, Mr Ross, with the limited time that I've got. A great many Scots made the respectable and honourable decision to vote in favour of Scottish independence. Many more, a clear majority, affirmed our place as a proud nation within the world's oldest union. On that first point, Presiding Officer, members including Richard Leonard and Sarah Boyack have talked about the importance of the Parliament and the Government having a can-do attitude to solve the problems facing the people of Scotland. I understand John Swinney even said earlier today Scotland must start focusing again on the things that we can do instead of regretting what it cannot do. Yet I have to say to the First Minister that many people will be thinking Scotland hasn't been the barrier to this over the last 17 years. It has been this SNP government. And he maybe wants to say that... I'll give away to the First Minister.
First Minister.
I'm grateful to Mr Bibby for giving me... I wonder if you could answer a specific point for me, which is about the implications for Scotland of the legislative change after the Brexit referendum. And I know he was involved in many of these issues in Parliament. Does he agree with me that it's important that those changes which eroded the powers of this Parliament are now reversed?
Yeah. Neil Bibby.
Well, we've been clear that the new UK Labour government is clear. We want to reset our relationship with the European Union, and we also want to see a reset relationship between the Scottish Government and the UK Government too. And I know UK ministers will be working to rebuild that relationship with the Scottish Government and other devolved governments across the UK. And in relation to that can-do attitude, it would be helpful if the First Minister could relay that to his own backbenchers and his ministers that seem to be lost, that point has been lost on them. The people of Scotland don't need to hear this can-do attitude on just one particular day. It needs to be a culture of leadership from the government every single day. Presiding Officer, I come to that point about cooperation. John Swinney is right, the Scottish Parliament was created 25 years ago after Labour passed the Scotland Act, and we mark that anniversary next week. We want to focus on the future, not the past. But if we want to take inspiration from the past, let's listen to what Sarah Boyack talked about, a spirit of collaboration in the early years of this Parliament, to see the powers of devolution used to their fullest and a spirit of cooperation rather than conflict to deliver for the people of Scotland. The new UK Government, as I've said, is committed to resetting the relationship with the Scottish Government and working closely with this Parliament in the best interests of the people of Scotland. We can match that approach and unite on our ambitions to improve the lives of Scots and working together in partnership deliver for them. One positive example of that joint working happened yesterday with the positive announcement of the Commonwealth Games coming to Glasgow in 2026. Another issue I've also said there needs to be work on is our future relationship with the EU, and we are committed to resetting that relationship. The Constitution and Europe Committee has recently published a report on the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, and we need to work together to resolve the challenges that it highlights. The Tories did make a complete mess of Brexit, but the one thing it has shown, and the SNP members and Lorna Slater neglect to mention, are the complexities, the costs and disruption from baking up a political and economic union. And frankly, Presiding Officer, leaving our biggest trading partner, the UK, would make Brexit look like a cakewalk. Whether it be Brexit or independence, the constitutional argument exists on a spectrum, not a binary. The question, though, facing members of this Parliament now is this. Should we wait for a constitutional settlement of one's choice to materialise, for better or for worse, or should we get on with making change happen right now? This is the choice the people of Scotland will face at the next Scottish Parliament elections in 2026. To continue the constitutional debate endlessly, or to accept the settled will of the Scottish people and use our place in the UK to deliver on their ambitions for a better Scotland. To fold our arms in disappointment, or to roll up our sleeves. The growing divide here is between the can't-dos or the let-dos. John Swinney talked today of the need for a reawakening. But with respect, I think it's the SNP government that need to wake up to what people in Scotland have been telling them for years. Let's not talk down this place's ability to make change. Let's use the powers we have to deliver change. Because the people elect us to make their lives better. They want action on the issues that matter to them, to help people on the NHS waiting list, to restore our once-leading education system and reverse declining standards, to tackle the housing emergency. They are looking for us to grow Scotland's economy. I believe on this side of the chamber, the side that is impatient to deliver a modern, dynamic and diverse Scotland, not in some imaginary future, will win that argument
Mr Bibby, you
and
must
not hide
conclude.
behind an alibi of failure.
Thank you, and I call on Craig Hoy. Up to 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And can I join Willie in the tribute that he paid to Alistair Darling, who was a fine public servant, and I think people across this chamber looked up to him. Presiding Officer, this debate has underlined how and why this SNP government has failed Scotland in the years since the 2014 referendum. Because, in short, the Scottish Government did not and still do not respect the result of a referendum that they lost, and lost convincingly. Rather than say enough is enough, they doubled down on division, and they have held people and business in political paralysis over a lost decade. A decade when Scotland should have been looking forward, not back over its shoulder to the divisions of the past. Turning to the motion, John Swinney already has the powers to create a modern, diverse and dynamic Scotland. I won't quite yet. The levers to control those powers are vested in this very institution. They sit in the hands of ministers sitting on that front bench. On tax, on welfare, on public services, the SNP have the power to make this country more modern, more diverse and more dynamic. But John Swinney and his party have actively chosen to do the opposite. The years after the referendum could have been used to heal our nation, to bury the hatchet and to end the division it created. But instead, the SNP have neglected to do the day job. They have failed to use devolution to bring our country together, and without doing so, they will not be able to take it forward. In short, Scotland would have been a better place, a more modern, forward-looking and prosperous place, had the SNP accepted the result of the referendum. Now, reflecting on today's contributions, Pam Gossell was, as I have always found her to be, entirely correct. As the first Indian woman and the first Sikh elected to Holyrood, Ms Gossell would have had much to offer about diversity issues in this chamber. Instead, as she noted, the SNP government chose to hijack this important issue to talk about one thing and one thing only, and that is independence, and that was clear from the contributions from SNP backbenchers. But as Alex Cole-Hamilton said, however much they talk about it, out there in the country, in the real world, in the pubs and the bars, restaurants and shops and streets of Scotland, it is no longer the priority even of those who favour independence. But we know this is what the SNP wanted to focus on in this debate. Kevin Stewart gave us a rhetorically excellent speech, but it was misty-eyed and simplistic in its outlook of how an independent Scotland would possibly function. Ross Greer informed us that as a much younger man, he was dispatched by the organisers of the Yes movement to go out and to talk to undecided voters. And can I just thank the organiser who deployed him on that tactic. Ash Regan, she did mention the weather, but she didn't mention her independence barometer. But I think even she would agree that under this NP government, independence is cold, stone dead. Now, of course, there are serious issues at the heart of today's debate, and it's because the government has failed to recognise a once-in-a-generation referendum. That was a failure of national leadership. But the failure didn't stop there. There was then a failure to grow the Scottish economy. The Scottish budget would be £624 million larger this year if they had. There was a failure only last year to ensure that the Scottish National Investment Bank, once the flagship of the SNP's investment agenda to function properly. It lost £14.6 million last year. There was the failure to pass on business rates relief in the budget, which is doing untold damage to Scottish hospitality and retail. There's been a failure on tax, with most Scots now paying higher taxes compared to those in the rest of the UK. And they failed to tackle waste, with £2.7 billion of taxpayers' money being squandered over the course of this Parliament. They have singularly failed local government, with councils' debt soaring to 1.5 times its annual budget. Now, Annie Wells effectively noted the SNP's failure on health, a failure to meet their cancer treatment target each and every year since 2014, a failure to tackle drug addiction, something that is now Scotland's national shame, with nearly 22,000 drug and alcohol deaths since 2014, a failure to tackle long waits in Scotland's NHS, where waiting lists have more than doubled since the 2014 independence referendum. And they failed on education too, which was meant to be their #1 priority. The worst ever results in international reading, maths and science. A level of violence and disruptive behaviour in schools has skyrocketed. And despite Nicola Sturgeon's promise, they have failed to close the attainment gap. And John Swinney's recent programme for government rose back on that commitment. But the charge sheet continues. The SNP have failed in their plans to launch a national energy company. They have repeatedly failed Scotland's oil and gas industry, which supports 93,000 jobs. They have failed on their very own climate targets, after missing them for 9 years out of 13. They have failed on ferries, 2 vessels now 7 years late and counting, and £300 million over budget. They have failed rural drivers, failing to dual the A9 and the A96, resulting in far too many avoidable deaths. The list goes on and on. The SNP have failed to meet their tree planting targets in 5 of the last 6 years. They have failed on their manifesto commitment to invest £25 million in rural housing. They have failed on their promise to install superfast broadband across rural Scotland by 2021. And let's look at the waste. £2 million of taxpayer money on civil servants working with Angus Robertson on independence. Over £200,000 on 13 independence white papers, which nobody is reading. And yet, the percentage of children living in poverty has remained the same in Scotland since 2007. And they have failed to hit the target of transferring all benefits to Scotland by 2020. Let's look at the police. Police numbers are at their lowest level since the SNP came to power. I will.
Audrey Nicholl.
I thank the member for giving way. Back in 2013, Theresa May is on the record as warning that Scotland would be denied access to the UK's most sophisticated and secret intelligence and counter-terrorism tools if we became independent. So, in other words, we would be less safe. I wonder if the member can explain how Brexit changed this, given that our European neighbours are our closest allies in this space.
In conclusion, Mr Hoy.
What is not keeping Scots safe are the lowest police numbers since 2014, and crime rising since 2014. Ultimately, this government has failed the test. They've also failed the transparency test. SNP headquarters have been raided by police.
Mr Hoy.
Nicola Sturgeon misled Parliament during the salmon scandal. Ultimately, the First Minister is following in the failed footsteps of his predecessors, failing to respect the result of the referendum, failing to use the powers of this Parliament to full effect and good effect. In short, in each and every single day of the last decade,
Mr Hoy.
The SNP has put their own interests first and the Scottish national interest second.
And I now call on Kate Forbes to wind up the debate. Up to 9 minutes, Deputy First Minister.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Well, I certainly can't believe that it's been 10 years since the independence referendum, a day that many spent years hoping for and campaigning for. And regardless of the side that you were on, it was a victory for democracy, discussing and deciding Scotland's future in a peaceful, largely respectful and thoughtful way. That is surely a success for all of us. And, Presiding Officer, I think the debate today has revealed some other successes. The freedoms we still enjoy to debate freely, to hold very different views and to represent every community in Scotland. And I would agree with Ash Regan about tempering our language to restore respect to the constitutional debate, and also with Willie Rennie. That extends to respecting that people can be patriotic and proud whilst taking different positions on the Constitution. And so, in the spirit of disagreeing well, I wanted to highlight a few comments that have been made. Douglas Ross said that independence wouldn't solve any of the issues that he highlighted as priorities. Foremost amongst them, he mentioned the rise of poverty. I assume that's the same poverty that's been exacerbated by his party's dismantling of the benefit system, baking indignity and inhumanity into it, and which only when devolved have actually become fairer. That's... Yes, I will.
Can I ask her then the same question I asked the First Minister? Why then, if these powers are so important to this Parliament, has her government returned them to the UK Parliament?
My question in response to Douglas Ross would be, what powers is he talking about? Because we have worked hard to devolve powers and to transform them, and the experience for so many people across the country has been dramatically different. That's the same poverty that catastrophically worsened under a Conservative Prime Minister who crashed the economy, sent interest rates rocketing and earned the mockery of the international community. And all of that delivered by a party in the UK government that hadn't won an election in Scotland since the 1950s. So there can be no suggestion that Scots ever voted for that. So yes, I'd have far more trust in the people of Scotland making intelligent, compassionate, wise choices than I'd ever have in successive UK Prime Ministers. And that brings me to Anna Sarwar, who claimed that bills going up during the SNP's tenure was a strong argument against independence, which makes me wonder what it means for the Union as energy bills spiral in only 2 months of Labour's rule. Two months is all we've had, but Scots will be poorer and colder for it in only 2 months. Labour promised to cut energy bills by £300, yet they've gone up by £149. Now, that would be a problem in and of itself, but this is an energy-rich country. We hear time and time again that Scotland has the resources, the assets for the just transition. We will lead when it comes to Labour's energy future, and yet Scots are paying more. So Labour's new campaign for the Union is that things can only get worse. Vote Labour to get colder and poorer. Vote no for a depressing, unequal, austerity-laced future. What a vision. And as Kevin Stewart said, all the threats that those in favour of the Union put to us back in 2014 did actually come true. We had prophets amongst us, but they came true because we voted no. We're out of the EU because we voted no, and Scotland's vote was irrelevant. We've seen successive UK governments mismanage the economy, leaving us wrestling with higher, more stubborn inflation and spiralling costs. But, Presiding Officer, we do need to look to the future, and I do want to end on a point of consensus. As the First Minister said, I think all of us are in politics because we want to be agents of change. We believe that the world is not as fair or as prosperous or as just as it should be, and we want to fix that. And we'll do that by listening to the people. We're accountable to them, and we owe it to them to represent their views and their experiences as diverse as they are, and nowhere more so than on the Constitution. We'll do that through collaboration. It is no small thing that those on both sides of the constitutional debate can still discuss their views freely and openly. And our vision is to break cycles of poverty so that there is equality of opportunity for every child, irrespective of where they're born or who they are, to foster aspiration, entrepreneurship, to unlock creativity, to solve the biggest societal challenges of our day in Scotland, in healthcare, in transport and in the transition to net zero, to share prosperity so that every family, household and person here in Scotland can make ends meet and thrive. I hope that we all believe that Scotland is wealthy enough, is talented enough and is more than enough. And it's up to us to stymie that or to foster it. I remain ever hopeful that the future will be much better than the present. Thank you.
Thank you. That concludes the debate on creating a modern, diverse, dynamic Scotland.